was the separatists remained in power in Quebec from 1976 to 1985. And finally, in 1985, they got kicked out. So they were in power for 9 years. And the Liberals came into power, changed nothing. Left the language laws in place, did not repeal a thing. So what happened was the federal government, which now had become now the Conservatives were in power in Ottawa, said we need to bring Quebec into the Constitution. They haven't signed it. How do we get them in? So we need to pass we need to come up with some sort of special powers for Quebec that will please them so that they can sign the Constitution, and then we can have a united Canada. Well, they tried that, and they brought in what's called the Meech Lake Accord. Meech Lake is a little place in Quebec where they have conferences with the premiers of every province and the prime minister meet and have a conference every single year. And at that year they met in a place in Quebec called Meech Lake, and they put together a constitutional package that would have offered Quebec new powers, including control over immigration, as well as control over language. Wasn't ratified by 2 of the English-speaking provinces because the natives objected to it. They said there's nothing in there about native power. Don't forget, the natives controlled the northern part of Quebec. Plus, the Cree natives, that was all the northern part was Crown land belonging to the Cree Nation. Plus, the huge James Bay hydroelectric power was up in the northern part of Quebec. And the Quebec separatists felt, we get our hands on that hydroelectric power in northern Quebec, we could be self-sufficient and sell our power to the rest of North America. Sounds like the North Sea oil, doesn't it? Except the only thing is, the rest of the country and the US has its own hydroelectric power. We don't need Quebec's power. But anyway, it sat on native land. And you can't do anything there unless you consult the natives. So anyway, the Meech Lake Accord died. So, because the natives weren't consulted. So then, the federal government decided, all right, well, we'll try again. We'll bring in another accord. We'll change some of the policies, and they brought in what's called the Charlottetown Accord. Charlottetown is the capital of Prince Edward Island, this little province here, and that's actually where the original constitutional agreement that set up the Dominion in 1867 was drawn out there. So the Charlottetown Accord, the Meech Lake had failed because the provinces of Manitoba and Newfoundland were unable to ratify it by the deadline. And so the government set up a royal commission on the future of Quebec. And at the Royal Commission on the Future of Quebec, in 1995, the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada made a presentation with the party leader, recommending to the committee that Quebec declare itself an independent republic. Well, anyway, so what happened was that just have to bear with me, ladies and gentlemen, the Charlottetown Accord was introduced, and it basically said, gave Quebec power, more concessions, and now they put it to a national referendum. Okay, so if you just bear with me while I'm going to refer to my notes here. And again, it was sovereignty association. Okay, but the Charlottetown Accord was offered by the federal government to give new powers to Quebec, and it would mean again more control over their own affairs within Canada. But it was put to referendum this time. Referendum in English-speaking Canada and a referendum in Quebec. Why Quebec would have a separate referendum, I have no idea. Failed. Both of them. Failed in Quebec because they felt it didn't go far enough. Failed in English-speaking Canada because they felt it went too far. So it will be just like the new powers that Westminster's offering Holyrood, but putting it to a UK-wide referendum. It's the same deal. they finally agreed on a constitutional package to offer Quebec, put it to a referendum. Quebec had said, no, we're going to have our own vote in Quebec. They rejected it because they felt it went too far, but it didn't go far enough. English-speaking Canada voted because they felt it went too far. And I remember voting in that, and I voted no, because I said, look, why offer new powers to one province? What about the rest? Why can't the other provinces have the same powers? They're like offering new powers to Scotland, they're not getting it to England, right? Or Wales or Ulster. So, because of the rejection of the Charlottetown Accord, I hope I'm not going too fast for you, ladies and gentlemen, okay? That caused a resurgence of separatism in Quebec. And what happened was that in 1994, the separatists were re-elected in Quebec. Right after the Charlottetown Accord vote was in 1993. 1994, the separatists were back in power in Quebec. They felt now they had been rejected because the new powers that had been offered to them had been rejected by them and the rest of the country. So it caused a massive resurgence of separatism in Quebec, which led to a second referendum in 1995. Now the second referendum, I want to read you the question. Again, it's a lot shorter. In 1995, the question was, do you agree that Quebec should become sovereign? Notice they used the word sovereign, not independent. After having made a formal offer to Canada for a new economic and political partnership within the scope of the bill respecting the future of Quebec and of the agreement signed on June 12, 1995. It's still confusing, but at least it's one sentence now instead of a whole paragraph. But basically, again, it says here, do you agree that Quebec should become sovereign after making a formal offer to Canada for a new and economic and political partnership? Well, and the result this time was a lot closer. Okay, the result this time was the no side won 50.6 to 49.4. Talk about razor thin, eh? The reason for that was Quebec, again, it's a confusing question. It's not, do you think Quebec should become independent? It's a very confusing question. I read that, what the hell do you mean? You know, we offer an economic, because they sweetened it by saying, we offer an economic and political partnership, then we separate. Okay? And people were angry about the fact that the package that had been offered, that English-speaking Canada had said no way to this new package of powers for them. So then what happened was that after that, a separatist party in Quebec at the federal level was formed. So it'd be like your SNP MPs. And that was called the Bloc Québécois. So we have the Parti Québécois in the Quebec Provincial Parliament, or National Assembly as they call it, and the Bloc Québécois in the Federal Parliament of Canada. And in the 1990s, they won 54 of Quebec's 68 seats in the Parliament of Canada and became Her Majesty's loyal opposition. Her Majesty's loyal opposition full of separatists, so that's really nice. But basically, the danger was your SNP are not the official opposition. They're in third place, and they're in the corner. In this case, the Quebec separatists were now the opposition in Parliament. Okay? And it seemed really strange because, but anyway, 82% of Quebecers are francophone, or we call them francophone, and 18% of Quebecers were English-speaking. Now, the interesting thing is the natives were pro-Canada. They were on the no side. But I think what had happened between 1980 and 1995 is a lot of English-speaking Canadians in Montreal had left. There was this massive exodus of English-speaking people from Montreal, from Canada. From Quebec. They just didn't like the sign. And they just didn't like, they felt threatened. They felt uncomfortable. So they said, all we have to do is go to the next province. We'll just move to Ontario. The Bank of Montreal moved to Toronto. I live in Toronto, English-speaking Canada. Hundreds of English-speaking Quebecers moved down to Toronto. Now, the second referendum, being razor thin, made French-speaking Canadian Quebecers who had voted yes. They narrowly lost it by this like 1%. They blamed it on the remaining English-speaking population in Montreal that had all voted no, and the immigrants who also voted no, and the natives who voted no. So anyway, but remember one thing though, the two referenda were 15 years apart, 1980 and 1995. And in between that, in 1993, had been this referendum on the constitutional package offered by the Canadian Parliament. So we're up to the 1990s, so we're getting close, ladies and gentlemen, so we're not too long now before we'll be finished. And so anyway, now, just want to let you know, the referendum on the constitutional package that had been offered in 1993, the result for that was 54% for no and 45% for yes. Okay, so 60-40 against Quebec separation in 1980, 54-40, 55-45 or 54-46 against the constitutional package in 1993, and then 51-49, okay, 50.6 to 49.4 on the separation in 1995. Okay, so what happened was that in 1990, now this part, I'm going to read to you now, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to listen very carefully to this. This is the part that can help you. And that is in 1999, after that narrow victory, right? And I can remember it. It was a real nail-biter in 1995. I can remember it. The Canadian government introduced what's called the Clarity Act in 1999. Now, I'm going to read this to you. In 1999, the Parliament of Canada, run by the Liberal Party, decided to pass an act called the Clarity Act, which set out the guidelines for how a referendum could be run. It said it required, okay, I'm going to read this to you. It set out the conditions under which the Crown in Council would recognize a vote by any province to leave Canada. It required a majority of the eligible voters for a vote to trigger secession talks, not merely a plurality of votes. In addition, the Act required a clear question of secession to initiate secession talks. Controversially, the Act gave the House of Commons, that's what we call our lower house, the power to decide whether a proposed referendum question was considered clear, allow it to decide whether a clear majority had expressed itself in any referendum. Okay, now let me just explain that. What it basically meant was that the secession talks would only start if more than 50% of all eligible voters had voted. Not just the people who bothered to turn out to vote, but all eligible voters, whether they voted or not. Now, if you take the Scottish referendum that you just had, I believe 80% turnout, was that correct, ladies and gentlemen?
84.59.
Sorry?
84.59.
Okay, so it's closer to 85%. And the yes side got 45. But if you factor in the other 15 or so percent that didn't vote, the yes vote would be down to about 37%, wouldn't it? Well, according to this Clarity Act, the federal government would say we would only negotiate separation if more than 50% of the eligible voters had voted. Which means that the separatists in Scotland would only get about 37%. They'd be way off. This is the kind of thing you need in this country. Now, it also said that a clear question, so none of this paragraph stuff or great long confusing stuff, clear question. Should Quebec separate? That's it. And apparently polls were taken that if a clear question had been asked, should Quebec be independent of Canada, support was only about 34%. It also gave the federal government, the House of Commons, the power to decide whether the referendum question was clear and to decide whether a clear majority had expressed itself. So in other words, the power to decide whether we could negotiate separation was clearly with the federal government. That was passed by Ottawa. Okay? So, in other words, now the good news is, I'm going to tell you a little bit of news here. During your referendum, the Parti Québécois, PQ, were advising SNP. So, oh, we've had referenda before. You know, I'm so glad that PQ are advised the SNP because they lost. It's great to have losers advising losers, right? That's my little joke there. And apparently the original plan, I dug out the Scottish referendum was to be like the Quebec one, with a great long question and using the word sovereignty. And it was, but David Cameron, your Prime Minister, came over to Canada and addressed our Parliament and had a talk with our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. By the way, they're both Conservatives. They're very good friends. And the one thing that Stephen Harper advised David Cameron to do was get an act like this, Clarity Act. Why wasn't it passed? Why wasn't it introduced in Westminster? This needs to be done, ladies and gentlemen. But it's being done in Canada. And the Clarity Act was passed in 1999. The Liberals were still in power at that time. And just jumping forward a little bit, David Cameron came over, and I remember that. He addressed the Parliament in Ottawa. I remember seeing it on TV, and he said, 2 nations, 1 queen, Canada was there during the war, buttered us up like anything. It's great. And then when he had close talks with Stephen Harper, our Prime Minister, and the one thing that Prime Minister Stephen Harper said to David Cameron was, there must be a clear, he said, you must have a Clarity Act like this. So that's why, when David Cameron got home, the Electoral Commission here in Britain went through the Scottish question and made it a lot clearer. You know, should Scotland be an independent country? But apparently, I read somewhere that in the wording, if they had put in, should leave the United Kingdom to become an independent country, the no vote would have been higher. Some people felt that it meant that independent of England, but somehow still in the UK. So, you know, think about that. But what you need in Britain, I'm giving these notes to Andrew Skinner, by the way, afterwards, because you're going to use it. Do talk to me if you don't understand it. This Clarity Act killed the chance of the 3rd referendum, because it gave the federal government the uppermost hand. And it basically said, majority vote, I mean, look, we're talking about independence here. If half the country, yes?
James, can I ask, the Clarity Act, how did PQ play that out? Did they say that this is an unfair thing?
Just coming to that.
Sorry.
I will tell you exactly what they said. Okay? It was widely considered by sovereigntists as an illegitimate piece of legislation, who asserted that Quebec alone had the right to determine its terms of secession. Sounds typical, doesn't it? However, now listen to this. The Supreme Court of Canada disagreed and ruled in favor of the federal government. There you go.
It's fundamentally democratic, though, isn't it? To say that if you're going to change the sovereignty status of your country, at least 50% of the country must, or more, must vote in favor of that proposition.
Well, that's right. And that's why they said the eligible voters. You know, the thing is that, can we just hold the questions? I'm going to come to question time in a few minutes. The point was that there was the issue over, well, how much is 50%? I remember the discussions. A lot of people felt 50% plus 1 is just not good enough. It should be a clear majority. How about 2/3? 60%. So what the federal government says is 50% plus 1 of eligible voters, which means every single person registered to vote, whether they voted or not. Which means, if you translate that into Scotland, it would have been, the yes side would have only got about 37%. And I think Andrew figured that out with us. That if it was all remember you figured out that if you include all the people that didn't bother to vote, this act is law in Canada. It needs to be law in the United Kingdom. Okay, moving forward. What eventually happened was Quebec's economy was going down the tubes. They were losing business. People in English-speaking Canada were boycotting Quebec business products. Though if you're English-speaking and you call a company in Quebec, they will answer you in English because they have to trade with the rest of the country. What eventually Quebecers got was referendum fatigue. They got fed up. This has been going on since the 1970s. We were now in the 1990s, almost into the 2000s, over 20 years, almost 30 years. People were getting tired. Jobs were disappearing. After the second referendum, the value of the Canadian dollar went way down. So they found that every time they went into the United States, it cost them more to change their money. Why? Well, because it's unstable with the separatists. Jobs were moving to Ontario. Okay, I know, I dated a woman and she had a job in Ontario and she got away from Quebec. Quebec now, the federal government has what's called transfer payments, where they give provinces a certain amount of money based on their economic performance. Up until the sort of recently, Newfoundland got the highest transfer payment from federal government. So in other words, each province has the power over their own budget. If they're struggling, the federal government will give them what's a top-up, which is called a transfer payment. And powerful, rich provinces like Ontario didn't need that much. Alberta, with the oil industry as it used to be, didn't need that much. Newfoundland was only relied on fishing, and the cod industry was dying. They needed more transfer payments. After the separatist second referendum, Quebec became the highest transfer payment in Canada. It needed that top-up because its economy was collapsing. And the fact is, investment was just going. Nobody would invest in Quebec. The first referendum was bad enough, but the second one made it worse, especially with that close vote. The investment said, no way, it's too fragile. We're not going there. People began to lose their jobs. And also the sign law, they got fed up with that. And what eventually happened was French-speaking Quebecers had enough. And so what happened was, in Quebec, and finally, in 2012, the majority government, separatist government in Quebec was thrown out. And the Liberals came back to power. Now, what also happened was, after the second referendum, the Quebec Separatist Party movement began to splinter into different parties. You have the Parti Québécois, but people felt, they're not extreme enough. So now you've got a second party called ADQ, Action Démocratique du Québec, and a third party called Québec Solidaire. And the separatist vote began to split into three parties: moderate, extreme, and more extreme. And so what happened was, in 2012, the separatists fell from power because their vote was now split, and also people were fed up. The Liberals came back to power in Quebec, and now the PQ are well into the opposition. Their votes splintered, and they're stuck there for quite a while. And I am pleased to say, in 2010, we had a federal election in Canada. The Liberals, who had always kowtowed to Quebec and give them, gone. Conservatives came into power. I'm not trying to be biased here, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just telling you what happened. And the Bloc Québécois, this made it so sweet, were reduced from 54 seats to 2. Isn't that wonderful? And the Conservatives picked up some of those seats. And the first thing the Conservative Party under Stephen Harper did, Stephen Harper's very pro-British, first thing he did, Queen's portrait goes back up in all the offices. The Canadian Navy will be the Royal Canadian Navy again. Canadian Air Force will be the Royal Canadian Air Force again. Every day the Union Jack supposed to be flown beside the Canadian flag will be flown. And Quebec didn't say a darn thing. They didn't care, you know. We were cheering in Ontario, believe me, especially the veterans, you know. 'Cause I served in the Royal Canadian Navy, so anyway, so basically what's happened is the Quebec separatist movement has collapsed because they started disagreeing amongst themselves, split into three parties. And even if you add up the seats those three provincial parties got, the Liberals still have more. And the and what's also, I have just been informed that the Liberal Premier of Quebec will be signing the Canadian Constitution in 2017, formally bringing Quebec into the Constitution so we will have a fully united Canada. And we are into a federal election at home. I'm going to vote when I go home. I won't tell you how I'm going to vote, but I'll tell you. But I'm going to vote. The Bloc Québécois are predicted they've got 2 seats now. They're predicted they will have 1 seat after the end of this election. Quebecers themselves just got fed up, tired. Referendum fatigue. They were losing tourism. Americans didn't go to Montreal anymore. They were coming to Toronto. Who that they couldn't read the road signs? You know, I mean, come on. You have stop signs in France, but you have arrêt signs in Quebec. You know, and stop signs in Ontario. In Ontario, so we get all the Americans come to Ontario. Hey, they spend their money. They're tourists, and you know, and you had that same hatred, you know, like the nationalists have towards English people. With the same problem with Quebec nationalists. When just last year, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, that's William and Kate, we call them Will and Kate. We love them. Visited Canada. 30,000 people turned out in Ottawa to see them. They went to Quebec. Duke of Cambridge spoke French. A bunch of separatists came out, put a Union Jack on the ground and started stomping on it. Guess what? The majority of the people that were there cheered Will and Kate and ignored them. So that's what that brings us up to today, ladies and gentlemen. And basically, that's what I wanted to tell you. Wanted to come over. I came all the way over here to share this with you. So I think what we'll do now, I'm finished now, the talk. Let's open it up, open the floor up to some questions.